Hello everyone, I'm Ali Ibrahim Nia, and I'm with you with a new episode of The Fact, the series that discusses international political issues every week. Today we would like to talk about the possible withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Iraq, and we have to respect a guest tonight, Dr. Scott Bennett. He is a political and psychological warfare analyst from USA, and also Mr. Patrick Henningson is also a political analyst and commentator from England. I would like to welcome both of you to the program. As the first question, I would like to go into the recent decision of Iraqi Parliament. And as you know, they have voted for the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Iraq. And I would like to go more into details about the evidences that Parliament has voted based on these on such evidences. So would you please explain about possible evidences that would be, persuading or convincing Parliament to vote against the presence of U.S. military forces in Iraq?
I think the Iraqi Parliament had full justification for asking U.S. troops to leave Iraq. There's ample evidence that the United States is in breach of a good faith agreement between the government in Baghdad and, of course, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So it's a very sensitive thing to host foreign troops on your soil just to begin with. And if you look at the situation that was unfolding last December, late December and early in the new year, it's just completely untenable that any occupying forces would be attacking any branch of your military at all. In this case, that includes the People's Mobilization Units, the PMU, or the Hashd al-Shabi. They were targeted by U.S. forces. And as it turns out, the evidence was completely spurious. The Iraqi officials were insisting at the time that there's, highly unlikely, if not impossible, that Kataib Hezbollah, a People's Mobilization Unit, a militia in Iraq, had attacked the K-1 base near Kirkuk. Yet the United States insisted it had intelligence that their base was attacked by Iranian militias. Where's the intelligence? Where's the evidence? They didn't wait for an investigation to be done. They ignored Iraqi officials and they went ahead and launched an attack on multiple PMU sites. So, on that basis alone, I would think Iraqi lawmakers would say that the situation is completely out of control and it's time that the United States and its military forces leave the country. They're there initially to help in the, quote, fight against ISIS in this last phase. But, of course, if ISIS has been defeated, really, in Iraq, then, what is the point of having the United States there? Not that the U.S. Did a great deal to fight ISIS anyway. Most of the hard work in that department and the heavy lifting was done by the Iraqi military, but also the PMUs, and help from Iran on the ground. And so not the United States. The United States flew mostly air sorties, and of those, most of the targeted ones that were, you could say, made any impact were done very, very late in the game in 2017. So besides that, the United States was fighting the Iraqi government all along the way to somehow, push aside the PMUs because they were receiving support from Iran. So in that sense, the United States was undermining the fight against ISIS at every turn.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to know if this decision was basically affected by this recent assassination of General Soleimani and Mahdi AlMuhandes. Do you think this assassination was in any way affected the Parliament's decision or not?
So it's important to look at the chain of events that happened. The U.S. claimed that its K-1 base in Kirkuk was struck by Iranian militias on December 27th. 2019. And then they claim after that that was justification for them to strike PMU facilities on December 29th, 2 days later, based on intelligence they claim they had. And of course, that caused the reaction, which was the protests against the U.S. Embassy in the Green Zone by comrades in arms of the PMU, friends, family, and so forth. The United States then blamed that on Qasem Soleimani and the Iranians, again with no evidence, only claims of intelligence. And then supposedly the reaction for this came a few days later on, I believe it was January 3rd, the United States assassinated General Qasem Soleimani and the PMU commander, Abu Mahdi AlMuhandes. And both of them were killed in the same operation, drone operation by the U.S., and then, of course, that led to the Iranian retaliation against the U.S., 2 U.S. bases in Iraq just 5 days later on January 8th. So arguably a bigger impact within the country of Iraq was, of course, Soleimani is a revered figure in Iraq as well as Iran, but more so it's Abu Mahdi AlMuhandes. The PMUs were national heroes. That's the national militia of Iraq. They fought, they came together after a fatwa by the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in July 2014 to fight ISIS, to mobilize. Hashd al-Shabi means people's mobilization. And so they came together, they fought, and they defeated ISIS on the ground. This is very important for the self-esteem of Iraq. And to have the United States come in and assassinate and kill the commander of that militia, the national militia of Iraq, means that the United States can no longer really be in Iraq. They've stepped over a line. The U.S. has lied to their own public and to the world, claiming that Soleimani was a terrorist and that Muhandes was a terrorist, when in fact those two men were leading the fight against ISIS. Arguably did much more on the ground than the United States ever did against ISIS. And now they've killed them and called them terrorists. So you can see at this point, you know, the reputation of the credibility of the U.S. is completely gone. And so there's really no way back. And this is a huge breach of Iraqi sovereignty as well. You can't just go and pick off leading military figures of your allies. In this case, Iraq was supposedly an ally of the U.S. But that goes for Iran as well. Qasem Soleimani was a major figure in the Iranian military. So you can't just order their assassination and then make up some speech publicly and claim that he was the world's leading terrorist. There's absolutely no factual basis to that whatsoever. But that's repeated over and over in the U.S. media, over and over in different publications, TV programs. The president himself has repeated this effectively, what is a lie. There's no other way to describe it. It's the opposite of the truth, in fact. But there you have it. So Iraq was left with really no choice but to press the eject button with regards to U.S. occupying troops. And the only pretext the U.S. could possibly have to stay is if ISIS somehow magically popped up and started becoming a menace once again in Iraq, and then the U.S. would say they need to stay and fight ISIS. Or if ISIS supposedly mounts an attack on U.S. soil, then the U.S. would say we need to stay in Iraq and fight ISIS, etc., etc. This has been the sort of pattern for the last few years now, and it looks like this particular cycle might be coming to an end.
Well, as you know, recently we had so much of protests and also, I can say, destabilizations in Iraq. And I would like to know if USA had any kind of role in all of these chaos, especially in recent events in Iraq, or not.
With regards to the unrest in Iraq, there were two types of protests mainly over the last 4 or 5 months. So the main was, I would say, student-led protest, which we saw really picking up momentum in October and running right through to December. This was chaotic. There involved arson. There are accusations that the government was firing and shooting and using snipers to kill these student-led protests in Baghdad and in other parts of Iraq. And there's still open investigations into who has been shooting the protesters in various situations. And there is a lot of chaos involved there. This led to the forced resignation of the prime minister of Iraq. So, but if you look at who's backing some of these protests, the U.S. spent maybe hundreds of millions of dollars building what they call civil society NGO networks ever since the occupation in 2003. And they've been building them, they've been investing in them, they've been helping them along, grooming them, you could say. And so for a moment like this, where they can absolutely mobilize them, it's no secret that many of these NGOs and, quote, civil society organizations have U.S. backing and U.S. support, either directly or indirectly. And so they do, in this case, they're quite happy with the U.S. presence in the country, and they seem to be taking on this anti-Iranian orientation. These protests contrast this with the Million Man March, which was just a few weeks ago in Iraq, in Baghdad, and this was 1 million people came out on the street to demand that the United States leave the country. Now, that was definitely not backed by U.S. NGOs and civil society. So there's two separate movements, if you will. And so the U.S. will try to characterize that as a Shiite-led movement or an Iranian-backed-led movement. But all in all, the U.S. media were very quiet about the Million Man March demanding the U.S. troops leave the country. Very quiet. So that was extremely interesting. So we'll see. But this is going to be a constant source of strife. Certainly, the student-led protests have some legitimate grievances in terms of economics, in terms of policies and so forth. But you also have to understand, and they should understand, as many do understand in Iraq, that the economy has been completely gutted. Mainly due to U.S. foreign policy, first with the war, then the occupation, then choking off Iraq's ability to earn money and instead routing oil sales through Iraqi Kurdistan and leaving Iraq proper to be sort of suffocated economically for years. And now they're threatening them in terms of sanctions if they trade with or cooperate with Iran, who is under U.S. sanctions. So this whole U.S.'s relationship with Iraq is just going from bad to worse. And the only thing left the U.S. will have if they do leave the country militarily is be able to work and stir up civil unrest and regime change through their NGOs, through their civil society networks. So they can only play the role of spoiler. No longer can they play the colonial role of occupier and viceroy. There won't be a Paul Bremer coming back to Iraq anytime soon. So this is a new phase in the relationship now.
All right, thank you so much. Well, now I would like to go into another aspect of the subject, which is the main reason that United States of America tries to maintain its presence in Iraq. Do you think this country still tries to get Iraq's oil? Is it still about oil that they try to be present in Iraq, or there's another major reason behind this?
The short answer is the American people are against the U.S. Presence in Iraq. President Trump has also said that he is wanting to remove the U.S. However, there are the military-industrial complex and the Zionist elements that do want to continue to have America in Iraq. And the oil drilling companies of Halliburton, Chevron, British Petroleum, and others are desperately trying to maintain a commercial presence in the Iraqi oil fields. So most likely the U.S. is going to continue to be there. However, it is also a very precarious situation because of the overwhelming negativity that the Iraqi people have expressed towards the U.S. presence and their commitment to not be a participant or a nexus for the U.S. to use in its military ambitions.
Okay, thank you so very much. As you know, recently we have seen that millions of Iraqi citizens and people came to the streets in order to show their protest against the presence of United States of America in Iraq. I would like to know about the effects and outcomes of this huge protest against this event.
The presence of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis protesting the U.S. participation in Iraq and its presence is something that is definitely woken up the American president. He has said he would be okay with removing the U.S. from Iraq, and I think the majority of the American people are also of that opinion. So the more Iraqis that peacefully assemble and protest, the more it is going to have an impact on the American president and the American people. Of course, if there are violent protests and attacks upon U.S. soldiers, that plays into the Zionist war machine and their continued propaganda that is driving the U.S. into endless war. But the presence of Iraqis protesting the American presence is certainly very powerful, and it adds to a strong consideration to remove the U.S. Perfect.
Thank you so much. I would like to also ask about this recent, threat and claim that political and military groups of Iraq has shown against USA. As you know, they have said that if United States of America tries to maintain its presence in Iraq, there would be consequences and dangerous consequences for their military forces. So do you think this threat by Iraqi military forces is going to be something very serious or not?
Well, I think it's very, very serious that the Iraqi people and the Iraqi political agents and the military have all united and demanded that the U.S. leave, and there's a very strong possibility that if the U.S. refuses to leave, it will erupt in some kind of a civil war, in some kind of a discontent with the political officers of Iraq, the Prime Minister and the other ruling parties, and of course Iraq could descend into a violent outbreak. So there is a very real possibility that if the U.S. does not remove itself, and if it does continue to launch military aggressive strikes against Iran and other areas, then it could be only a matter of time until violence and civil war and protests and things that generate a serious conflict against the U.S. forces could erupt. In closing, the hope is that the Iraqi people and the Iraqi military and the Iraqi politicians will unite with the Russian and the Iranian and the other neighbors of the region and all commit to a peaceful coexistence, while at the same time voting for the U.S. to be removed and petition and appeal to the United Nations as well to play an active role in facilitating the removal of the U.S. So the U.S. is certainly not a welcome party in the Middle East because of much of the destruction that it's caused, but at the same time it's also has to be persuaded diplomatically, economically, and informationally rather than militarily, because the last thing anyone wants is another Iraq War 2.0.
All right, now we have come to the end of this episode of The Fact. I'm really thankful to both of you, Dr. Bennett and also Mr. Henningson, for your fruitful and informative explanations about the subject. I'm looking forward to having you again on next episodes of The Fact, and I would like to say goodbye to everyone. Have a good night and goodbye.